Okay, so thanks everybody. You've come to Sensational Surveys, fantastic. We hope that you will know, without giving too much away, that some of what you're going to look at might not be sensational, but that's the idea, that you actually critique some of the things, and then hopefully you'll be able to confidently produce a sensational survey. So Liz, do you want to start with introducing?
Yeah, my name's Liz Austin. Some of you may have come across me before as part of the evaluation work for the QAA Scotland enhancement themes. I work at Sheffield Hallam as Head of Evaluation and Research, and I have used surveys both well and badly for many years. I thought I'd just give a couple of examples of where I've used it in the past, and then I'll pass on to you, Stella. But I've used surveys for end of session feedback. I've used surveys for post-intervention feedback, and I think the use of kind of survey or feedback gathering is useful language to think about. I've used surveys in kind of funded research with students, with staff, with sector nominated contacts at institutions, for particular interventions, for particular bits of evaluation, a real mix of reasons why I might have used them and different approaches to them. And like I said at the beginning, not all well. So sometimes when you start to receive the responses to a survey, you realise the error of your ways in some way. So hopefully I can bring a little bit of that learning to what we're going to be talking about today.
Wow, follow that confessional. Well, I've always done, I'm Stella Jones-Devitt, and Professor of Critical Pedagogy, and I work with Liz as a stunning double act on the evaluation themes work for QAA Scotland as well, and Liz and I go back in time a long way, and I must confess I've always used a perfect survey. So one of the things that we're going to look at, I'm quite anti-surveys if you can use something else, so I'm probably the other extreme. However, I'd like to think it's not because of lack of skills, and there is absolutely room for a good survey. So we've posted in the chat there, and if any of you don't feel shy, it would be really interesting to hear from you. We've got quite a kind of activity-based afternoon for you, and it's quite sunny here in Manchester, so I'm hoping that you've not given up too much this afternoon to join us. So please let us know, why you're here. Is it a 3-line whip? Is it because you want to find out more? Is it because you think that surveys are great, or you struggle with them? You use them in your role. What is it that you are actually doing with them? That would be really good if you could share that with us. So please post your stuff in the chat, because it'd be really helpful. Claire's already put she doesn't use surveys and doesn't claim expertise. That's a good starting point. So what we will do, there'll be lots of time just before we move on. There'll be lots of time to actually talk, discuss, share your ideas. We've got a bit of a kind of content-led bit to start with as well, but please please use the chat. And if there's absolutely anything burning, stick your hand up, and there'll be time at the end as well. So please don't worry that you won't be heard. You will, if that's okay. Right, Liz. So just, I think this is me, just to remind you that what we're going to do, we're hopefully, as you can see there, we're going to try and build confidence if you feel you need it to use survey, particularly around evaluation. So that's the idea of it. And hopefully by the end of the 2 hours, you'll be starting to think about effective decision making concerning why you might use a survey or why you might not. You will also be looking at how can I maximize participation, engagement and response rates as part of that. I'm not going to steal Liz's thunder, but there's lots about ethical considerations that you might want to also think about. And equally, we're hoping that at the end of the workshop, you'll be able to produce the sensational survey. I mean, what would be really good as well is if you can think of any what we call unintended outcomes, anything that you can think about that you might think, well, what else might be an outcome from this? It might be that you use surveys more. What are you hoping to get? Because the more you tell us, the better. I'm just looking in the chat, Liz, we've got quite a few. We've got, thank you, Helen, uses surveys with staff and students. They've got survey fatigue. I think we all know that. Hi, Steve, you're looking at using surveys. Don't worry about being inexperienced, believe you me. And then Heather, you use a lot of surveys and you'd like to check if there's things you shouldn't be doing, wouldn't we all? So that's great. Thank you for that. That's excellent. Okay.
Okay, so I've got the task of providing the juxtaposition of the heavenly and the deadly in relation to surveys. Thank you, Stella, for those titles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the things, the positive things about surveys. We absolutely want to say that they have their place, but it's absolutely about thinking about what that place is and making sure that you've got a really clear rationale for why that survey needs to be designed and then administered. Quite often we default to surveys, and I think that's what we're trying to suggest today, is that we would introduce a pause and a point of reflection based on the kind of heavenly and then the deadly, the things that the pitfalls we can fall into, the traps, the difficulties and challenges that surveys may bring. So I'm going to talk you through these, and then we'll move to a whole group and you can provide your own reflections as well. So starting with the heavenly. So surveys can gather large amounts of data relatively quickly. Now, the key phrase in that is relative. So think about what the alternatives could be and think about whether the type of data and the speed of which you want to collect that data is the thing that's most important. So again, thinking about that rationalization. So in comparison to something like a series of 1 hour interviews, which not only take your time as the researcher, facilitator, but the respondent's time, there is a difference, there is a clear difference. That's not to say that these should be the only factors in your design of a survey, but they play a part. So whether you've got a particular reason for introducing that survey and whether you have a deadline does play a part in your consideration. My suggestion is it's the type of data rather than the speed and the size that needs to govern the use of that survey and dominate in that conversation. The second point is that surveys can be used anonymously. So it is possible for participants to complete a survey without providing any personal details or personal data. Now, I'm not going to get into the realms of GDPR and data protection regulations, but there are things to think about in terms of the type of data that you collect and then store, and then how you do that appropriately. And there are guidelines and regulations in relation to that. But if you want to collect data anonymously and you want to use a generic link, if that's an online link, you can do, and respondents are able to reply without providing any personal information. That's not to say that you may be identifiable through the answers that you provide. Stella gave a little story in another session that we were in about how in some research that I had done, I could tell her responses were her, even though her name was not in there, because of the language that she used and the familiarity I had with that language. So there are boundaries of anonymity that we have to think about, but the use of anonymity is an ethical practice. It can give people confidence in providing opinions that they might not want to do face to face in an interview or a focus group or an observation type setting. But there are also some pitfalls with anonymity that we will come to, but there is the opportunity for that. So think about why anonymity is important for your data collection, what confidence that gives respondents, and what guarantees you could give on the basis of that anonymity, but also think about what limitations that could bring. Other benefits is that you can use already validated tools. It is exceptionally hard to design a good survey question, and it is not something which we should take lightly. But there are survey questions that already exist, and there are surveys in their complete form that already exist, that have been tested, piloted, gone through a kind of cognitive interviewing process where you test and refine questions with potential participants. And we are able to take some off the peg and deliver them without falling into some of the pitfalls of newly designed questions and tools. So there is, so for example, scales, validated scales for measuring specific types of outcomes. So if you're thinking about medium-term outcomes and behaviour change of students around demonstration of self-efficacy or motivation or confidence, there are validated scales that you can use, and you can kind of take those questions and implement them. And they're relatively easy to find, much more dominant, I think, in psychology or the in kind of behavioral sciences, but they do exist, and they do exist in other spaces as well. In terms of the kind of reporting and presentation of data, surveys can provide relatively straightforward visual analysis of the data that you've got. It helps distill information quite quickly. It can present in a creative way and visual way, and that can be useful in terms of where you want to present and who your audience is. In order for visual representation of quantitative data, primarily in a survey, it says straightforward. It's not always straightforward to do, but that presentation of data, survey data in that way, has its benefits. In order to analyse quantitative data, and I appreciate that there may be qualitative data in a survey as well, you will need some understanding of statistical data analysis, or at least some understanding of what claims you want to make. So for example, are you looking at the percentage difference between respondents? So what's the comparison between how many males think X and how many females think X? So a basic understanding of what quantitative data can tell you is useful, and how then you present that in a visual table, graph, pie chart sense is important to think about at the beginning, and that all links back to the claims that you want to make in relation to those outcomes that you are looking to explore. Relatively inexpensive when compared to, again, interviews, focus groups, observations, and I'm thinking about expense here in terms of time, resource, travel, and so on. Can be done within a shorter time frame. You are able to set date parameters, and you are able to kind of prompt so that you increase your, or hope to increase your response rate through that time parameter. Again, think about what the restrictions are on that for your participants. And there is a claim here that surveys can reduce researcher bias, because the distance between the researcher and the participant is much greater than in some other more subjective or interpretivist methods. So if you are in an interview situation, your very presence in that as a researcher in that interview setting can impact on how your respondents reply to your questions. In a survey, there's a greater distance between you as the researcher and you and your potential participants. What that means is that you can't prompt, you can't explain or re-explain. The importance of good question design becomes really critical here. In relation to the deadly then, the possible pitfalls of surveys, and this is important to highlight as well. A low response rate is something which we found very challenging in higher education settings, specifically if we're dealing with students, but that's not, it's not the only area of low response rates. And we're finding, particularly at the moment, within institutions, that we are seeing variations in attendance, variations in student engagement, in teaching and learning settings, which also mean that these kind of additional requests for engagement in research and evaluation are becoming difficult to produce. And what you find with a low response rate is that it can have an impact on your data. Your data struggles to make the claims that you want to make because you don't have the body of data that you were looking for. And some of that we put down to the impersonalized process. So it links back to that point I just made about the distance between researcher and participant. So if you are sending out a link, an online link via an email, who does that come from? And does the recipient know that person? And are they likely to respond to that? Or is it a dear student type approach? And we've certainly found that the more personalized it can be, the better. The second one is it can include or induce skewed responses due to poor design. And this is, again, critical that your questions, and we'll spend quite a lot of time looking at this today, but bias can be built into questions. So starting a question with, do you think, suggests that there is a right answer or a way of answering. So it is possible to build in bias to your questions, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we look at question design. Survey fatigue, somebody mentioned, and again, I think this is an issue. And you need to think about your survey and how your survey can impact on all future surveys. So your survey is one of many that a student group or a staff group or an institution may receive. It might be adding to a list, a pile of responses that students are asked to engage in. And the more that they have, the more that might become a strain to respond. And then how does a student work out what to prioritize? And if there's a really good, meaningful survey, that it might mean that is given less weight and less attention. So over surveying for me is an ethical issue, and you have to think about the impact beyond your current context on all future data collection and relationships and research with your potential participants. Surveys can be oversimplistic, specifically if you're looking at very complex explorations of, and in an evaluative space, those possible outcomes and unintended outcomes. So how, having a don't know answer or a not applicable answer or another answer gives you slightly more than a closed response or a long qualitative open comment box. But there is a way that you've led the respondent into thinking about those questions that doesn't allow for some of the complexity of some exploration to be considered. And again, you may be collecting data that isn't able to make the claims that you want to make. So, for example, a new quantitative representation in terms of an answer will not give you why the respondent has responded in that way. It will simply give you what their response is. There is a possibility that spurious claims can be made from incomplete analysis. Somebody got their microphone. Oh, it's got it. We're okay. So spurious claims from incomplete analysis. So there is a tendency to take out statements from our survey designs without the context. So, for example, 69% of female graduates were employed in highly skilled employment. We don't know what type of employment, we don't know what courses they were embarked on, we don't know the sense of the job market that they were going into, we don't understand the context of that experience. So we can make grand claims around survey data at times, which sometimes overlook some of those other issues. Sometimes inappropriately as a quick fix. Sometimes we are asked to survey. Sometimes we think that that's the right approach because we are time poor. And sometimes it's not the quick fix that we hope it can be. Pulse surveys, for example, Silla and I have talked about these in a lot of details, often are designed quickly, not a lot of time to be tested and piloted. And what you get is a kind of inconclusive reaction and response from your sample. So how are students finding online learning is one pulse survey that we've tended to do fairly recently. So 50% of students say online learning is effective, 50% of students are saying their on-campus learning is effective. Well, in terms of how that helps us to develop policy, practice, decision-making, moving forward with strategy, it tells us very little. So I think sometimes there's that notion of a quick fix. And the last one, there's lots and lots we can say about surveys being intrusive, specifically in the way that questions are designed, the context that might be missing, who is being sampled, reminders that can be sent, which are impersonal reminders, which are nudging towards a response rather than the respondent wanting to complete. They complete because they're being told to and reminded to. So there are, ethical issues here, and specifically if there's some algorithm at work here, which is doing the prompting, reminding, administration. There are pitfalls on this side as well. All of that needs, in terms of my perspective, needs testing, piloting, drafting, preempting all possible answers as a human responder, and that's where that context is needed. So I hope that has been in some way useful from our heavenly and deadly. Really interesting to know what people are saying in response to that.
Well, Liz, there's a few things in the chat, but before we go through that and just pick out some things, because there's some good stuff in there. Does anybody have any, we've got a couple of minutes, anybody got a question about what you've just heard where you might want to stick your hand up or come in and ask anything? Don't be shy. By the way, while people are just thinking about that, Liz, I've just posted my infamous, I am not an algorithm, I'm a flawed human. Do you remember me saying that? Anyway, enough of that. I think, Susan, you want to come in.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, yeah, it's just a quick question, and it's slightly tangential because I do use surveys quite a lot. And as we were going through, you were kind of saying, have you considered the alternatives? And I'm thinking, well, what are you using as good alternatives to surveys for these kind of like, because I've got things where I give people evaluations at the end of taught sessions, and sometimes it's a group of people I'll see again, and sometimes it's groups of people I won't see again, and I'm just curious to know what other people are using to kind of expand my repertoire.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think if you are at the end of a session and you're seeking some quick feedback, if we do a session like this, and we might do a post session, a bit of evaluative work to see or we might do that pre and post. It's difficult to see what the alternatives might be in that setting. But I think there are variations on what can go within a survey in terms of type of question, or there are other more dialogue-based, discursive elements of methods that we could employ, but they do take more time and more energy. But I'd be interested to see what other people are doing.
Mm.
Can I come in, Liz?
Yeah.
What I use, Susan, I think it's a really good question. I mean, if I was, for example, in a session, I think it's also considerable forward planning. One of the things that I do is that so what? I've always done it. So literally, I will get to the end of maybe if it's a taught session, for example, and I know this doesn't work all the time. So we have a session at the end for 5 to 10 minutes, which is, so what have you learned? What have I learned? How does this connect with what we've done? What do we need to think about for the future? And is there anything else? And actually, if you start to do that, yes, it's kind of anecdotal, but it's very in the moment, and actually is very helpful to do that kind of, as you're saying, how do I actually just grab this stuff and get the zeitgeist of the feeling in the room or immediately after or whatever? I mean, even today, if some of you post on there, thanks, or everybody, I know people have got to go, but can you imagine if, like, with half an hour to go for no reason, people start dropping out? That kind of tells you a little bit about maybe how people are finding it. So there are kind of, I think we sometimes labour the written word rather than the stuff. And Liz and I have done lots of stuff. I mean, there's loads of things like SMS texting. I'm not at all suggesting that people, particularly in the time of COVID, go and touch a smiley face on the way out of the room or anything, but they've been used as well. there's a kind of whole array of things. I've used word cloud as well, just got people to post a word and then corralled it together. There's lots of things you can use, but I'm not suggesting at all, and Liz isn't either, that a survey absolutely has its place.
No, I'm totally. I know it sounds an odd question to ask as the first question, but I think it just got me thinking, and partly because there's a group that I'm seeing every couple of weeks at the moment, and I've made a few. I've used Microsoft Forms, and I think 2 people filled in the first one, and one person has filled in the later one. So they're clearly not giving me what I want, because I genuinely do want a wee bit of feedback, and and now I'm thinking of some of these alternatives, or even just having like the 5 minutes at the end to kind of grab people. Yeah, so thank you. That was really helpful.
Yeah,
basically.
and thank you. And they're not in, and of course they're in the room with you. But equally, that it's, I think when we use surveys sparingly, which we'll probably come on to, that makes the survey you use more effective, because then people are more likely to respond to it, rather than it's just another of many surveys they fill in. And therefore you might get a much better response rate from your survey if people start doing less surveys all the time.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, because basically there's some big things that I need to do more fulsome surveys of, but these are little things which don't really need to be a survey, and maybe that's what I could,
The other thing,
3 is enough to decide it's not going to work for that particular task, and then let's find something else.
There's all sorts of stuff you can do to energize a room as well, and then I'll shut up, because you've touched on a subject I love here. I mean, you can move people in a room. You can go, right, there's that side of the room, there's that side. How useful have you found it today? Move to where you think. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can do it.
I say rooms, I'm meaning virtual rooms, so I don't physically have them, but yeah, I need
virtual as well.
Yeah.
So you could get them to, draw something. I mean, whatever.
Or move themselves about. No, I will definitely have a think about some options, because the problem is like you're saying about reliable surveys, like one survey response isn't enough for me to do anything with. So even some anecdotal stuff in a room from a bigger group would be better, because at least I'd hear, I don't know if it's the same person every week who answers or if it's different people, but at the moment I'm catering fully to their needs.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I was just going to say, so in the virtual room, I mean, you haven't got the anonymous nature of it. So I think there's another avenue for providing, feedback in a personal way, if it doesn't want to be kind of outed in a bigger space. But the problem with the survey sometimes is the time between and the distance between the activity and then when you send out the information. So in an online space, some polls or quizzes or the power of an emoji in a chat box, or that evaluative, just engaging in that evaluative thinking gets people used to the reaction and the reflection, and then possibly the survey maybe for if it's a series of events, or if it's a kind of a pre and post, and you've kind of preempted why it's you really talked about why it's necessary and what you're trying to ascertain through it. And so I think in an online space, Stella and I do the kind of stop, start, continue at the end of sessions, where we get people to and sometimes people email that to us, and people say openly in the session.
What I was just thinking as you were saying, is that basically what I use is a variation of stop, start, continue. It's nothing fancy. I just send it out afterwards, and I'm actually wondering if I'm pretty much, it's 3 questions. There's various ways I could hand that, give them virtually, get them to fill it in, and if I got more responses and it's done. I mean, it's partly because obviously it's a teaching course, so part of what I'm doing is getting people to think about the need to evaluate sessions.
Yeah, and Helen, thank you for that. Helen McLean said about Mentimeter, which is another way of doing it. I mean, the other thing you could do is just get them to post a word, anything, and then do a word cloud of it or something for next time, or even maybe more radical, which isn't radical at all. Why don't we all explain the situation to our audience or our participants? Say, right, we're going to do this differently. Maybe this week I'll start with X. What do you think we should use next week, just for variety, and start to get people to think about it as well. And then they start to get ownership of it, and then you're more likely to get response rates. So anyway, it's so easy when it's not you doing it, of course.
No, that's brilliant. And I can see some people have put stuff in the chat as well.
Yeah,
so
there's
this
great
is all
stuff.
Brilliant. It's just making me, it's just kind of, So I'm sorry, it's slightly tangential, but really, really helpful to me. So thank you.
Okay, so there's loads of stuff in there, vignettes and polls and loads of stuff. So please read the chat. I think we're going to move on to the activity, Liz, if that's okay, if that's possible. So this is where we'll need your colleagues' help, Claire, please, because one of us will, if we do 3 rooms, if that's okay, but don't do it yet. What we're going to do, we've sent you a survey in advance, the wonderful Biscuit Challenge survey, okay? I'll be severely worried and delusional if you can't find what's wrong with this survey. The irony is, I loved putting it together. That's what's worrying me. Just how many things can you spot? We'll do some feedback afterwards. What we've got, just working backwards, we need to be back here in our bigger group by 3. So say 25 minutes, including the right for you to go and have a cuppa or something. So essentially, if we have maybe 3 groups, yeah, Patricia will make sure that we post the survey for you so you can see it as well. So can we do that? Is that all right, Claire and your colleagues, if we come back into the room at 3, but we try and give ourselves at least within that 25 minutes, 10 minutes break, but integrated just in. We'll decide as a little group when we want a break, if that's all right. But let's get into the rooms first and then we'll see where we go.
Yeah, that's fine, Stella. I'm hoping my colleague Alana is fiddling away with buttons in the background. So what we're looking for is 3 groups of equal size with either Stella, Liz or I popped into one of those groups, Alana, and we'll come back at 3 into 3.
It's not a tragedy. It's not a tragedy if we can't all put into the groups, because I'm sure we can all talk about it anyway.
Yeah, so Alana, if you can send us to our breakout groups now, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
This is where I'm going to go, da, 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 where we're all waiting to know whether we can go into our groups. Looks like something might be happening. Oh, yes. Hooray. So see you soon.
Yeah, join your groups and we'll see you back soon.
Anybody else? I hope you enjoyed that, she says, tongue in cheek. Perhaps we can just start with just a couple of responses from each group. Liz, what about your group then, Claire's?
Yeah, my group were great. Openly admitted that they love critiquing other people's work, which is why we carried on and didn't have a break. But yeah, picked up on all the points I think that we were meant to pick up on, including things like font, color contrast, and we talked a little bit about what should have gone in a brief and a debrief as well. But general sense that it was a shocking survey. And there should have been a question at the end, which was any other comments. And in that question, you should have replied just how bad it was. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. I'm glad you're so appreciative of my work. Thanks for that. Claire, anything from your group?
Yeah, equally, we were pretty scathing about this survey. Many of the points that Liz has raised already, we picked up. The whole thing just looked really bad. It wasn't accessible at all in terms of the way it looked and the way it was laid out. Lots of leading questions. There were where you had potential multiple responses. They didn't always match up to the question that was being asked. Yeah, it would have been very annoying to be trying to answer that particular survey. Nothing at all about what was intended to do with the data, whether it was anonymous. It was just really bad all round.
Sorry, it's really interesting. Even though, colleagues, I genuinely did that deliberately, it's still harsh when you hear criticisms of your own appalling work. Claire, can I just bring you back in for telling everybody what E120 is, please?
Well, if my memory serves me correctly, I think it's a red food colouring.
Yeah, correct. It is. It is. And for vegetarians, it can be linked to cochineal as well, which is the other issue. Helen, I can see you nodding there. So I want to bring in my group, just to anybody who wants to say something about that, because I think there was one question that we found pretty hilarious, and then there was another, I think it was you, Paula, I'm putting you on the spot, that noticed something as well about the title. So I'm just going to bring Paula in, and anybody else from my group, if that's all right.
It was just the use of the word challenge, and that seemed to set a different sort of tone than one might expect from a survey. And so it already sort of preempted how someone might feel towards it before they'd even begun.
Anybody want to comment on from my group on what they found as the, because I think we found a couple of the questions quite objectionable. I mean, amongst lots of the questions. Anybody got a view on that from my group? I don't want to speak for you if somebody wants to come in.
I particularly liked the seventh question, I think it was, the one that kind of in the question you had a suggested answer, an assumption from whomever was writing the question. Sorry, Stella, I know you're loving this. About the kind of a response that the person filling out the survey might have. So yes, I love that presumptuous nature of it.
Thank you, Patricia, and you're absolutely right. I mean, on a serious note, there's lots of stuff that problematizes people's relationship with food, actually, and ethically, it's an absolute minefield, as you've already picked out. There's no debriefing, there's no rationale. The title itself is awful. And that's before we come to the spelling errors, which weren't deliberate, by the way. They weren't accidental, they were deliberate. The layout where the boxes were corrupted, the categorizations that didn't make sense. I particularly enjoyed with my own hand the doing things where you ticked a box and there wasn't a box, and then you highlighted stuff and then there was stuff that you didn't know what you were doing with it. So I threw everything in there, plus some really horrible font sizes and faces, which Liz knows I have a thing about fonts. And you quite rightly picked out just a complete dog's breakfast on accessibility and understanding. And of course, the categorizations that don't make sense, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, whatever. So draw your attention to the survey questions to avoid things. Liz, do you want to say, because there's a lot of stuff listed on there about double-handed questions, etc. But Liz, you sourced this, and I was saying to my group, you might want to come in and say about this resource, if that's all right, briefly.
Yeah, I can do. So there's an organisation, it's I think they're based in Canada, actually, called the Evaluation Academy. They do have a lot of open access sources, which cover both the fundamentals of methods and evaluation design, and then some more kind of intermediate to advanced stuff. But they're quite, I find them quite accessible resources. They're all free and open access. You go through a kind of process of putting your details in so they know who's accessing their content, but there's no fee and there's no charge. So this was, I think I followed them on Twitter and maybe somebody on LinkedIn, I can't remember, but I saw it and thought, oh, this will be great for our survey session. And they do little infographics like this, which are quite useful to use, I think, at the point of design. If you've got a group, anybody, teaching research methods like I did for many years, this is a really great go-to resource as well for that. But I think most of the things that we've talked about today are on that list. We talked a little bit about jargon in that first question, Stella, and had some questions about ash and whether ash was in biscuits and where that came from, and the kind of percentages and the kind of highly specified nature of what was being asked. We talked a bit about double or triple negatives, I think we had in one of the questions, double barrel questions, and you had double barrel questions in a qualitative answer, but they're more problematic in a closed response answer as well, because you might have two statements put together. Do you agree with this and this? And then you have to say whether on a continuum whether you agree or disagree, but you might agree with one and disagree with the second part of it. So there was lots of things that that are useful in this little infographic. So yeah, I would recommend just their resources in general, actually.
Thank you. I've posted, hopefully my cut and paste skills are good enough. That's the link that's in the chat as well. So Liz, I think we'll, if everybody's okay, that was just a bit of fun, but now we're going to move to how do you actually do something that looks good? So over to Liz.
Yeah, so we've touched on most of these, I think, but just to reframe it now into what you can do to make your surveys the best they could possibly be. Before you even get into any of these key factors, you go back to the conversation that we were having at the beginning about, is this the right thing to be doing? So you're thinking about your possible respondents, you're thinking about how you're going to administer the survey, so administratively and practically, and then you're having these considerations at the point of design. Is this the best thing that we need? And like Susan was saying, possibly it could be. We thought it was. We've discounted other possible data gathering mechanisms. We're going for a survey, right? Let's make it the best it could be. So these are kind of things that we've put together, and Stella will talk a little about some other resources that we've got in relation to this, but I'll go through them one by one. So the first thing is access. So to think about how your respondents are going to complete and fill in your survey is really important. And it's important that you test this and that you see whether different mechanisms might work better than others. Who sends and who grants that access is really important. So if it's coming through email to students, what we found in some of the work that we've done is that if this comes from a known contact, somebody that they recognize as a name on that email, that you're likely to have an impact on response rates. If access is being granted and requested by a relative unknown, it's not linked to the course, it's not come from somebody that they know, trust and respect, then that can be crucial for response rates. So how you access the survey and who makes it available is really important. And there's a couple of different ways that you can provide an online link. Obviously, if we're thinking about the face-to-face in real life world, we might have paper copies and we might be distributing them in a face-to-face format. In the online world, it might be a link, and that takes you through to a survey platform. Lots and lots of different survey platforms that you can use. Some are free to use, some are by subscription. The ones that we've used in the past, we've used a Google form, we've used a Microsoft form, we've used Qualtrics. JISC Online Surveys is the one that we use at Hallam, and we've got a license to use, and all of our questions go through there. And Qualtrics is another one that I know is used. And access can be a generic open link, so anybody can respond. That has implications if you're posting it quite publicly, that you might get people responding that you don't want to respond, so members of the public rather than members of the institution. Or you might be providing access through targeted communications. So sometimes we will feed into our survey platform student numbers and student email addresses. That becomes our sample, and then that's going out directly to those students. So for example, if we just wanted to survey our level 4 students, we would create a targeted sample and it would just go to those students. And you are able to track those students based on the information that you pre-hold about them. And then you've got to get into the kind of context of anonymity. All that needs to be explicit. But there are different ways of approaching access that you might want to think about. You also want to think about how your respondents are going to complete your surveys, and don't assume that they can do this without help, whether there is a need for explanation, whether there is a need to put context within a survey, whether there's a discussion that needs to happen as part of the completion of that, and how that can link to your response rate. If you're able to discuss it before it's sent out, if you're able to contextualize it for students, if you're able to provide prompts and hints throughout the survey to provide support, then that can have a positive impact on your response rates. Incentives is an interesting debate. If you have got a very, very large sample, so you're going out to all of your students in an institution, you probably can't afford to pay them all a £10 Amazon voucher for completion. But can you incentivize, or should you incentivize, is an interesting dilemma at the point of survey design. We did a little bit of work to talk to students about what type of incentives might work. Things which are prize draw, that you never find out who has ever won, you know, that laptop that you've advertised as part of your survey, students tend to think are a waste of time. But something which is personalised, if it was a smaller sample and you were able to personalise or contextualise that incentive, might hold more weight. What you have to think about on the flip side of that is how incentives could bias your responses, so that respondents are completing because of the incentive, not because of they want to give truthful and authentic, trustworthy answers. It's really important that you're transparent if you have used an incentive. I think that there's lots of publications out there which talk about student surveys which never disclose that an incentive has been used. And I think it's really important that we are transparent if we use one, and use them proportionately. But we can talk a little bit about incentives if that's something that people want to pick up. This came up a little bit in the pre-exercise, the length of a survey. So we don't want to people to drop out halfway through. There are survey platforms where you can track completion. So the JISC online survey will show you at what point people start to drop out and not complete. So you can see how many partial completions you've got and how many full completions you've got, and you can start to make some judgments about that. So length is critical. Students and anybody doesn't want a 50 to 100 question survey. Nobody wants that. If you test your length, and I was talking to my group about Microsoft Forms that does give you a ability to test how long respondents are taking. Something like that is really useful. I can't remember the number, Stella, that we said was it about 13 minutes was the optimum time?
Heather has won a virtual Jaffa cake in the chat room. She got it right.
Yes,
yeah, 13 minutes
13
with caveats,
minutes.
obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Depending on the type of survey that you're administering, and the type of questions you want people to ask, and also how many times you're asking them to complete that same survey. So there are pre and post surveys, before and after an intervention, may take a little bit longer, a little bit less. A Delphi survey, if anybody's ever come across those before, which are repeated 2 or 3 times, sometimes do a lot of rank and prioritizing to get a consensus across multiple time periods. They may have a different time allowance, but think about length, think about how likely it is that people are going to get to the end, and then return that information that's important for what you want to claim. Timing and possible information fatigue, again, really important. Test, pilot, cognitively interview if you can, which is where you walk through potential participants or nearest likely participants to answer the questions, but then explain to you the experience of answering those questions. We'll tell you a little bit about timing. It'll tell you a little bit about how much information you're asking for and whether respondents are getting weary in in your request for their information. We talked a little bit in the biscuit challenge about how you may create gentler questions at the beginning of a survey to ease people into the content and the topic, and how something like definitions or checking out people's awareness and understanding might be useful initial introductory questions. And then what you can do is you can route based on those responses. So not everybody is answering every question. They're only answering the questions that are applicable to their answers. So if they answered yes, they go to question 12, for example. And that also helps with timing and information fatigue for those that might feel like they're answering questions that are not applicable to them. Question wording, we've talked a little bit in terms of the applicability of the language that you use. We talked in our group about how biscuit might have a cultural reference. So maybe in other countries, biscuit means something slightly different. And have you tested that to make sure that the phrasing and the terminology that you're using is understood to the same degree with your proposed sample? There was also another question, another word that was in the biscuit challenge. And I can't, somebody remind me what that was, which
Florentine, Florentine, I'm just posting it, yeah.
Yeah, and there was another one, the first question, what was I can't remember what it was, but there was a phrase that could be interpreted in different ways. And it's important that you get, that everybody's responding with the same level of understanding, so you're not getting kind of divergent understanding. And question ordering, as we've talked about, is also important. Sometimes we might think about in our survey question formats, making it engaging if possible. It's not that surveys are not the most engaging thing, but they can be more engaging than I think we do design them. So vary the questions, change the type of question, ranks, Likert scales, open questions, different presentation formats. Sometimes if you're presenting statements, how far do you agree with the following statements? You might want to alter positively framed statements and negatively framed statements, which kind of, then you can tell if someone's just gone B, 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 and just ticked all the same responses. So sometimes you want to, and it really gets people to read the questions when you change how they're framed, so that their attention is there, rather than assuming, I think, what the question might be asking. And then in terms of reporting and debriefing, we talked, again, our group talked a little bit about briefs and debriefs and how important they are at the beginning and the end of a survey. A brief which would clearly say what the purpose of the survey is, how the data is going to be used, and really importantly, what value the respondent is adding to your question, your claims that you want to make. And in a debrief, you've got both that ethical reiteration around consent and anonymity and withdrawal and all those things that are really important, but also signposting as well. If you have talked about anything to do with well-being, you know, the emotions connected to biscuit eating, and you would think that somebody might need help with their biscuit eating, then some signposting towards external or internal services might be important. This is particularly important, I think, if your survey is anonymous, because you aren't able to follow up on any concerns that you may have within the boundaries of confidentiality, duties of care, for example, that somebody might report as part of a survey. And that's why it's really important to try and preempt what might happen. And also make sure that anybody that's participating in a survey knows where this survey is going to be reported. Do they know where to find their input in relation to the collective input? Where will they go and look? Will you send it out to them? Is that even possible if it's anonymous? But where will they go to see how their views were incorporated into that wider analysis? So the importance of what the survey is trying to achieve, and making respondents feel like they're part of the reporting element as well, rather than that kind of take the data and leave, that they might have a vested interest in what you've found. So that would be my suggestions for what a good survey looks like. I'd be really interested to see whether anybody's noted anything that I might have missed.
Liz, I think Claire's put a really good point. I was just typing it, but I might as well just say, Claire, you've asked the question about can surveys be too short? And I think it just picks up what you've just said, Liz. I was just typing, depends on the purpose and the audience, maybe. I'm not sure, I don't know whether you are, Liz, that there's been a lot of work done exploring what a short survey, you know, the perverse incentives of a short survey might be. I've not come across much exploration of that. Have you?
No,
It's an interesting one.
I think it is an interesting one, and it absolutely goes back to the purpose. So a Delphi survey is often quite short because you ask it multiple times, and it would be maybe there's one or two key questions that you rank and prioritize, and then they ask you again, and the responses are being condensed, and it's about getting towards a consensus across a specific sample. So they are quite short, specifically the ones that I've either completed or been involved in the design. There is something about if somebody has opened that survey and they're willing to engage, you want to then make the most of that opportunity in the moment. If you then only ask one or two questions, there's potentially that there's a missed opportunity. So if you've been able to sell this, communicate it really well, gone through a new known contact, the students that really understand, or the staff, what the purpose of that is, they've gone in and you've asked one thing, then it's the impact that has on how their time is valued, of the legitimacy of the research and evaluation potentially. So it's those kind of things as well. But I think the length has to be appropriate to what it is you want to know.
Thanks, Liz. And the other thing before we move on to your next activity is I've just thought of it now because we've been having a bit of a discussion about Florentines or Florentines, dependent on how you want to pronounce it. And that brought home to me one of the things that we've kind of hinted at, but not maybe fully explored, is the kind of cultural issues around survey design and the wording. Now, sometimes that can be ameliorated by piloting cognitive interviewing, where you get people to react to a question very, very promptly and tell you what they think about it, whether they understand it. But that's an interesting one, because I'm not sure that lots of people might not know, let alone the argument of a Jaffa cake, a Florentine, whatever. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? The cultural connotations, let alone perhaps the nature of some things, and we've not got time today, but perhaps in subsequent sessions or follow up at some point, the whole thing about are there questions that are more difficult to ask in certain cultures or not, let alone when other stuff.
Yeah, and I think that also goes beyond cultural connotations, and just a wider conversation about the appropriateness of what questions you ask in a survey. So I know, so for example, in relation to race equity and the Race Equality Charter, there is a survey, a staff and student survey that we've been involved in administering. Some of the questions that you ask in that space are really difficult, and I mean difficult in a good way, but to do that at a distance has its challenges, and to make sure that that everybody that completes that survey feels supported to complete it, feels listened to. It's the appropriateness of the questions, isn't it, across the board, I think, which takes. I think people think it's easier than it is to design appropriate questions and to think about the topics that are being discussed within those questions. Yeah, I think Patricia's got her hand up.
Oh, great. Come on in.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm fascinated by all the conversations relating to kind of wider narrative of diversity. So thank you for bringing this to the forefront of our conversations. I think it's much needed. I have a question, and it's okay if this is something that we potentially could maybe discuss at the very end, if this is not the time for it. So I do apologize, because so I have a very hands-on experience with one of my previous employers, where the diversity questionnaire was designed by, and it was, just to say, it was very thoughtfully designed by a white this is interesting, Freudian slip. Okay, white straight male. And the conversations that we had then that came from this questionnaire were actually about presenting the data. So we ran several events, and the conversations were surrounding, because that person who designed the questionnaire, they also kind of collated and analyzed the data. and put a lot of work into it. And again, very kind of mindfully going about the process. However, then there was a question about whether this person is the right person to present this data to the quite diverse group, or whether we kind of make sure that we rebalance this situation with maybe co-presenting someone from marginalized groups, or maybe we don't, because that was his project and that was something that he has done. So it's also interesting because I know we're talking about the design of the surveys and questionnaires and so forth, but how do we then disseminate this data is, I think, contextually quite an interesting conversation. So I would I generally, because it was such a kind of a very involved conversation and debates that we had at this at a team about this. So I would be very welcome to kind of hear your thoughts on this as well.
Well, I think let's leave some of it till and see what time we've got. I'd also be really interested to carry that discussion on. Just for me personally, a very quick response, which is not fully adequate for now, but we better do the next activity, I suppose. And Liz, tell me if I've missed anything here briefly. I think the word heterogeneity has to come in here. So for me, I think you raise loads of really interesting questions about who, first of all, it's the purpose. You should be thinking about dissemination, briefing, policy change at the point of design. So therefore, those questions should appear at that stage. That doesn't mean to say that, you know, somebody who isn't part of that group might not present it. It might depend on the purpose of what you're doing. However, if you are asking a heterogeneous group, my obvious response would be the heterogeneity of the group should drive the design. That would be my, and by design, I mean the whole thing. That would be my thoughts initially. Liz, have you anything else, or have I missed anything?
No, I would say the same. Can't say that. If your concerns around reporting, I think, could be transplanted to the beginning of the process, and then would head off the concerns at the end. So if the questions around who's designing, why they're designing, and the potential bias that goes in at that point, if the wider conversations haven't happened, I think there's a potential for that data not necessarily to be the best it could be, and do justice to the people that are completing it, to be quite frank.
Fab. Okay, we might come back to that, Patricia, if we've got time, but I hope that's okay for you for now. I think you've touched on a really important area. Can we, if that's okay, can we move to the next activity, please, Liz? And do you want to introduce it? And then what do you reckon? I'm just looking at time. If our colleagues could say, what we need to give people enough time to feed back. So what, 10 to at the absolute latest. So 18 or 17 minutes, whatever the finger on the pulse of the breakout rooms is. If it's easier, just put us back into the same rooms. I've got no view on it if anybody else hasn't. Would that be okay?
I mean, that would be fine with me, if we're able to just go back into the same breakout rooms. So the idea of this activity, and Stella sent round our survey research design checklist prior to Claire sent it prior to the session, and it essentially goes through some of the things that I've talked about on the previous slide about how to design a well-informed, well-designed, well-crafted, thought through survey. And what we're asking in this breakout room is a little bit of confidence and exposure to talk about your own experiences. So if you're able to consider a survey that you've used before, if you're able to share a little bit about that with the group, and then use the critique of the kind of things that we think work well, that would be the next part of the activity. So those of you that thought they got away with critiquing just Stella's work, now we're moving on to think about how some of these things apply to our own context. Yeah, so if you do have something that you're able to talk about and share, that would be really useful.
Thanks, Liz. So could we get organised back to those rooms if that's possible? Fab, we're off. See you soon, colleagues. Yeah, I think let's just go to this so that we've got enough time, but take some feedback from that activity, just from your respective groups. Perhaps, Claire, if we start with your group, how did people find that? Did any, without, dwelling on it too much? I mean, we found that helpful, and that was an evidence-informed checklist. We didn't just throw it together as I did with my terrible survey design. What was your sense of applying it to real world?
Well, Stella, we were actually focused on a particular survey that Heather Fotheringham shared with us from UHI. So we weren't specifically looking at the checklist, but we found the content of what we discussed before that activity to be really helpful in directing conversation about the particular questions that are being asked in the survey. I think Heather found it quite helpful, and I think from my perspective it was really useful to apply what we've already discovered through the workshop in an actual survey that's being used. I don't know if any other group members want to comment about that.
Yeah, I can come in and just to agree that actually I found it really useful to look at those principles in a survey that was live. And whilst I think the biscuit example was great in terms of showing the obvious pitfalls, actually to look at something that was a little bit more nuanced was really useful for me. Thanks,
Vicky. Yeah, and that, just to say, I mean, you sometimes, by the way, there is a theory, and Liz has heard this before, the theorizing around the biscuit challenge survey is based on the wonderful work of a guy called Rom, R-O-M-M, and it's about using caricature to invoke response. So there is a theory that underpins even, not, goodness sake, not the design of it, but actually the pedagogic principles. So thank you for that, and thanks for the feedback. We did want to move on to a kind of now what works as well as what didn't. So thank you. So Liz, your group.
Yeah, thanks, Stella. So yeah, we all shared an example of a survey that we'd reflected on based on those the principles in the design checklist. Jamie talks a little bit about a double question that he'd amalgamated as part of some evaluation of teaching, which he kind of knew at the point of design that it might not work, and then realised after when he'd only got one response to a question, he didn't know whether that was a positive or negative response. Joy talked a bit about piloting a questionnaire with employers and how that really helped. We talked about the importance of briefs and debriefs, and then we all touched a little bit on analysis, which we haven't really had time to talk about today, but it's also an interesting thing which we might want to consider. So not only the quantitative analysis, the kind of what knowledge do you need in order to be able to do that, and do you design that in at the beginning? So do you think about what you want the analysis to do as you're designing the questions? But Helen was talking particularly about qualitative analysis, and how do you make sense of the qualitative open questions when you've got so much and different interpretations, that kind of subjective interpretation of what's there and so on. So we talked a little bit about that as well.
Great, thank you. And does anybody, I mean, Paula, you offered an example. We worked through the whole thing. Any thoughts from my group on anything else that you want to add to that you've just heard? Okay, I think what's come out is that, and Vicky, I think you mentioned it, there's two things, isn't there? It's easy to design a bad survey, very easy, but actually it is more nuanced, and you do have to think about what you're doing when you're designing a new one. And just finally, before I pass over to Liz, I think the question about analysis comes back to purpose every time, doesn't it? Because if you're getting into real knots with open text analyses, I would suggest that you might want to think about using something differently, but that's for another day, as you say, to explore. So Liz, over to you to wrap up, please.
Yeah, thanks, Stella. So there's a few resources on the screen there if you want to explore this in a bit more detail. So there's a blog that Stella wrote about if you have to really do a survey. There's some ethical stuff from BERA, which is the British Educational Research Association. And then there's the link to the survey research design checklist, which we did customize to a learning gain survey. So this was a bit of evaluative work that Stella and I did. I can't remember whether we're recording this or not, so I don't know quite what to say about that. But it was a really good bit of learning about what works in relation to survey design. Let's leave it there. So if you want to read any reporting about that or learn a little bit more about that, it taught us a lot about good survey design, and that's essentially formed the basis of quite a lot of the things that we've said today. We know from harsh experience. Yeah. So the kind of things that we hoped that you would achieve today, apart from the conversations, which have been really useful, and the considerations of surveys in different contexts, we've hoped that you have a few tools and resources now to go away and think about surveys as effective evaluation tools. We hope that you now kind of, and I think you did before, appreciate that this is not an easy option, and that often it's that default, but it's something which does need the time and consideration to design. And I think for evaluative purposes, it's really important that you link it to what is it that you want to know. So as Stella said, coming back to that purpose. So we've talked a little bit about the ways of designing efficient and engaging surveys and giving you some tools to do that. And we've talked a little bit about ethics as well. So we're really hoping that you've shared some examples in the chat and amongst yourselves of ways which you can take this forward if this is something that you're wanting to do for your future work. And we hope that you can now design sensational surveys. If that is a decision that you've made, that's definitely what you want to do.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
And not a biscuit challenge.
Not
Can I hasten to add, please don't do a biscuit challenge. There's an interesting question from Heather, from Helen in the chat, which people are responding to, about whether you should use personal emails, etc. Generally not, because the students there in a different capacity, unless they absolutely specify, which I can't really see how you would trail that. But equally, can I just put a plug in, because we will be in the future as well. If you've enjoyed this, we will be doing something in the future on active focus groups and doing that slightly differently. If you haven't enjoyed it, then you can always vote with your feet and send me a copy of your biscuit survey challenge, can't you? Anything else to add, Liz or Claire?
Not from me. I hope people found that useful, and sorry I haven't been able to see the chat while I've been sharing the slides, but hopefully we've got a bit of a record of that as well. But yeah, they absolutely have their purpose, and you know, you absolutely demonstrated that you've got that critical head on, which is the point of what we're doing as evaluators in that space, is to encourage you to do that. So yeah, great. Thanks for your engagement, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. You're now free to enjoy the sunshine, I think, aren't they, Claire?
Yes, and thank you to Liz and Stella and everyone for your contributions. It's been really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.